compensatory education is a legal remedy. It was created by case law. It is not something that is explicitly in the statute of the IDEA. So it is something that is judicially created as a remedy for a denial of a free, appropriate public education. Compensatory education services are intended to put a student in the position they would have been in, but for a denial of FAPE. So it is something that is very individual in nature. It is above and beyond the IEP. It happens separate from the school day, and it is designed to make up for a period of loss. And compensatory education is a qualitative analysis. This is something I get asked a lot. If my kid missed 10 hours of speech, do they get 10 hours back? And the answer is no. You get back the services you need to remedy the harm from the loss. And sometimes that means hour for hour, and sometimes that means more, and sometimes that means less. And it's really a very individualized determination. And even bigger picture than that, why is compensatory education something that we're talking about? Very, very quickly after schools closed in March 2020, the US Department of Education issued guidance almost immediately to say, if schools are closed and students with disabilities do not get services, then when schools reopen, you have to determine if there is harm and if compensatory services are needed. And very quickly after that, MSDE, as well as DCPS and other state education agencies, issued the same guidance. And when this slideshow goes on the website, these links are live and you can read through that guidance directly. So what happened during virtual instruction? I think we all experienced this immediately after virtual instruction started, or maybe not immediately, about a month later. We started getting these individualized distance learning plans that outline the services that your student would get during virtual instruction. So when this first happened in the spring of 2020, the services in the distance learning plan were a list of what are we affirmatively going to do between now and the end of the school year related to your child's IEP. I think that's when we saw a lot of reductions, especially when elementary schools were at most 2 hours a day, no school Wednesdays, and middle and high schools during this initial period were just check-ins as needed, and then formalized plans were made kind of on an individual basis. Then in the fall of 2020, we saw a shift, and that shift went to kind of the flip of that. Okay. So in the fall of 2020, we saw the opposite of that. The distance learning plans were now saying the IEP in its original form is in effect, with the exception of these things that cannot be done virtually. A lot of those things were like activities of daily living that you might have worked on in school, but you can't work on through a screen. Or, you know, my son has an accommodation around his backpack and locker and cubby being organized. Well, there was none of that. So those are the sorts of things that were not worked on virtually. And I think a really critical point is that a lot of times the distance learning plans were less services than what were in the original IEP. And some of that was just practical in nature. Related services that were delivered in a group went to being one-on-one. And our related service providers only have so many hours in a day. If they're split between 3 schools, they couldn't do as much as they would have if they were in the buildings. The Maryland State Department of Education has issued some findings that these distance learning plans count as an IEP amendment. And the reason that's important is because from what I've seen in these comp ed discussions, schools are starting from the IDLP saying, okay, well, this amended the IEP. This is what we were responsible to do. And I think that's true. They were responsible to do what the distance learning plan agreed upon, but that's not the whole story. And I'll talk about that in the next few slides. So I think when you are acting as a parent or an advocate, you should start with what the original IEP said and start with those services and those goals. If goals were changed, if they could not be addressed, or anything that couldn't be done in a virtual setting, we then have to look at how did that impact the student? Did they lose skills that they used to have? Did skills remain stagnant? Or did the student fail to make progress because the IEP could not be worked on in the same way that it could be virtually? And if the answer to any of these questions is yes, I would consider a request for compensatory education services. So what information do I need as a parent to have this conversation? This is where all of our valuable data comes in. So anything you have about your child can be part of this conversation. This can be the IEP, the progress reports, report cards, MAP scores, other test scores, work samples. I think that our teachers were extraordinarily forgiving of our children last school year, and we saw a lot of kids get a lot of opportunities to try again until they got the grade they wanted. And that's great, but sometimes that A is not reflective of a skill. So digging a little bit deeper into the scores can be important when you're looking at comp ed. Another piece is that anecdotal information. What did you have to do as mom, dad, grandma, grandpa, big sister, little sister to support your learner at home? For me, I had to a lot of times turn into mom, the one-on-one aide, and that was the only way to get things done. So when I was talking about compensatory services for my little guy, it wasn't he needs after-school tutoring. Well, he needs to learn how to work independently again, because that is something that I really felt got lost in this process. I think this is where it becomes important for you as a parent to really write down and even do it as a chart, IEP, IDLP, and what was taken out. Thank you. Because if there's anything that was different that could not be addressed virtually, you're going to want to have that conversation to say, okay, for the last 18 months, we could not work on X skill. And I need to hear from you how this will be addressed. Are we going to increase how we work on it during the school day, or are we going to do it outside of school through compensatory education?
What is an IDLP?
IDLP is an individualized distance learning plan. It is the thing that was created when school went virtual, and IEPs could not be followed kind of in their full form. The state and the US Department of Education gave leeway for school systems to create something for the purpose of distance learning. Yes.
Even if you don't sign a distance learning plan, is it still in effect? Is it still in effect?
I would say yes, because in Maryland, we are not a state that requires consent, with a few exceptions around more restrictive placements. So I would say, even if you did not sign that distance learning plan, even if you said, I disagree with this distance learning plan, once it was finalized in their computer system, they were operating from that document. Because we are not a consent jurisdiction, it is then up to a parent to exercise their due process rights or mediation rights or state complaint rights. I am not licensed in Virginia, so I don't know the answer. I'm going to guess that Virginia is equally, we're all in the Fourth Circuit, so I don't think Virginia has a greater right for parents and students than Maryland does, but I don't know for certain. And it's the same thing in DC, if there's anyone here from the district. We don't have to have consent to initiate a change. It is up to the parent to object and object legally. And I think I skipped through the last point, but if I'll just say it out loud rather than try to click backwards. If there's something that you don't have data about, now is the time to ask for that to be collected. So if you have a skill that wasn't worked on and you don't know where your kiddo is at now, this is the beginning of school year data collection time, where you can say to your case manager, to the teacher, you know, I'm wondering how my child is really able to do this skill because it was something they couldn't work on during this virtual experience. So what are the factors that we look at to determine compensatory education? MSDE issued a parent's guide, which in the slideshow version you can click through and read. And IEP teams should be looking at data from before school closures, during virtual instruction, and upon a return to in-person instruction. So for some kids, you might not have been able to have these conversations with your school yet, because if they did not go back until August 30th, you're missing that piece of information of what do they look like now and what do their needs present like now that might be different. Am I clicking? It's not clicking. let's see. I don't know. It worked before. I might end the screen share and then restart it. Does that sound like a reasonable plan?
Everyone, Kim's clicker is not working, so we're going to try to end the screen share and restart it. Stand by for just a moment.
It's actually not. Okay, stop share. There we go. When are compensatory education decisions being made? Many of you may have gotten this letter. This was the letter that MCPS started sending out at the very end of last school year and into the summer. Oh, we're not clicking again. Okay, so don't mind me if I'm looking down if you're in the room, but MSDE has directed school systems that within a year of that distance learning plan, that IDLP, is when these comp ed decisions should be made. If an IEP team knows a student did not make progress or regressed, you can have that conversation just as soon as you have that information. You don't have to wait for the 1 year mark. Yes. They have not sent a similar letter. As of the end of August, DCPS did not have guidance to their local schools, and OSSI had not sent guidance to the DCLEAs, including DCPS and all the charters. Yes. Repeat. I got it. So the question was, is this something that you have to affirmatively request? And the answer to that question is you should not have to, because the guidance that the state gave the local school systems and the locals gave the schools was to do this affirmatively for every student. If you read the letter towards the bottom, it says some students have made adequate progress and may not be eligible for compensatory education. If your child is eligible, you will get a phone call. So that means that somebody somewhere is making preliminary decisions that we as moms and dads are not a part of. And if you don't get a phone call and it is the end of the first quarter, I would say you should pick up the phone or shoot an email to say, hey, I heard we're supposed to be having this conversation. I haven't heard from you yet. What's your plan for my child? Yes.
I don't want to give you finish your thought, but my son went to extended school year this summer. It was in person, or the other I can go in person. I don't know that they call that compensatory, but is that what NCPS was doing in terms of providing compensatory services?
So the question is, what for a student who went to extended school year, is that what MCPS considered compensatory education services? And the answer is maybe. So if you were already eligible for ESY and that is something your child would get as part of their IEP, then it is not compensatory. That is a half day from 9:30 to 12:30 or whatever it was. MCPS in some schools did extended day ESY. So they did additional services from 12:30 to 3. That could be compensatory education. But if that is something they did for you, for your child, they should have told you that it was compensatory on top of the school day of the ESY day, so it shouldn't be a surprise. And I just want to back up a few questions because I realized I did not repeat. Somebody in the chat asked if similar guidance had come out from DC, and the answer to that is as of the end of August, no. I have not checked the OSSI website recently, but as of a few weeks ago, OSSI had not given similar guidance to DCPS and its charters. Another important point, which I think goes to the question that was asked a few moments ago, is information that a student experienced a loss of faith does not have to come from a school. It can come from the parents. So if you feel like your kiddo really did not do well and you expect that they experienced a harm that needs to be remedied, you can affirmatively ask for it. You don't have to wait for it to come to you.
Karen,
Yes.
somebody online asked, what if your school proactively offered compensatory education at your last IEP, but in hindsight, it may have been too early or before you had more information? So can you go back to revisit the discussion or is it too late?
So the question asked is, what if a school proactively offered compensatory education in the spring, and now that you've had some time to reflect on that, you realize it wasn't enough, and is that a final decision? The answer to that, like many of these questions, is going to be maybe. So it depends on how that compensatory education was delivered, because in some instances, there's an agreement that they ask parents to sign that essentially says this is all of the comp ed. And if you've signed that agreement, I would say you might be stuck with it, or you might be in a harder place to argue outside of it. But if it was in the context of an IEP meeting, I don't see why you couldn't ask to revisit it. And if your request is denied, then have the opportunity to challenge it. So how is parent input considered? If you are in MCPS, you might have gotten this document. I got this document, and a lot of my personal feelings about Zoom school, I think, came out through my responses. So I thought this document was interesting. I only received it for one of my children, so I know that not everybody is using it. And I can't think of if I've had clients receive this particular form. But it starts with, what progress did you notice your child made during virtual instruction? And for me, I was kind of like, you're kidding, right? Like, he made progress because I sat right here next to him almost every day and repeated instruction and acted as an instructional aide. So yeah, he made progress, but like, come on. And I realized, you know, perhaps they were trying to have a positive mindset, as we do nowadays, and it wasn't intended to hurt my feelings, but my feelings were not in the best spot when I got this form. But I really think it was important. They included in here, do you have data? And I don't think any of us were told to collect data as moms and dads at the beginning. So I, in that instance, provided some anecdotal information to say, well, I wasn't collecting data, but here's what it took to get my kids through the day. His school knew, his teacher knew, we were collaborating almost daily, if not weekly, on how to keep my little guy engaged. So this was not new information for anyone, but I thought the way it came out after the fact was kind of interesting. Yes.
When you say data, I mean, like, if I need to collect data, what am I collecting?
So the question is, what am I collecting as data? I did have some parents who were collecting data along the lines of, how often do I have to prompt my child back to instruction? Or for kids who like to close their Chromebook and run away, how many times did they close their Chromebook and run away during an hour? So some of it was really specific. And I think some of it was more anecdotal. Want to do the chat question?
Sure. Are non-public schools supposed to be considered comp ed as well?
So the question is, are non-public schools supposed to be considering comp ed? And I would say yes. Virtual instruction is virtual instruction. I have said this a lot over the last year. I adore my kids' teachers. They are the most wonderful human beings, and they're great. And the magic of their Zoom rooms, in some cases, was just not going to reach my child. And the same is true for a non-public. Even though you're really getting the most amount of special education available, having it delivered in a virtual way did not reach some kids. And what we really have to look at is the impact on the kid, not what was available on this side of the screen, so to speak. Yes.
Relating to data, I know that for some of the Zoom classes that they were recorded. Part of that recording session is me sitting next to my child as my child's one-on-one, since he did not have that at home. And that is what it took in order to have her have access, and want to be able to see, to break things down in small chunks and to explain and simplify so that she's able to understand. Would that be considered data since, again, Zoom
So I would say, the question is, if I was with my child and the class was being recorded and they can physically see that recording, does that count as data? And I think those recordings were not saved longer than 72 hours. So I don't know if you can rely on that. But what I think you could rely on is clearly the child's teacher knew that mom was sitting right there. The question is, does that translate to compensatory education? And that is a different question. I think in my case, me sitting next to my son allowed him to make progress consistent with his peers. And I can't ask MCPS to go back and pay me as an instructional aide because that's not how this works. But if you're back in school and now you have a child who's not able to perform and not able to access instruction because they relied so much on that one-on-one that they still need it, then what do we do about it? And I'll talk more about that as we go along, because part of it can be compensatory education and part of it is, guys, we need to talk about, does my kid need a one-on-one aide in the classroom now? And that is a different conversation than compensatory services.
I have one more question.
Yes.
Are grades the only indication of whether your child made progress, what the grades are not those, or still regression? Because there was grades for reflection of parental input, like you said.
So the question is, are grades the only data point that you can use to look for progress? And I would say absolutely not. I would shy away from using grades because I think grades are not a great indicator in this particular setting of student performance because of everything that I've talked about. You had a parent at home helping, or you had a child who kept redoing the work, or because certain things that were not turned in were excused and didn't count as a zero. I think the flexibility that our kids were given and they deserved means that sometimes they got grades that were higher than their skills reflect. Sorry, as I adjust my math. So I would actually look at your MAP scores are usually a pretty good data point because those are taken every year. You can look at them over time. Reading levels, which we don't use after third grade, but that's a story for another day. But if reading levels went down, also look at the IEP goals and the progress reports. If your IEP goal said student will, complete 10 math problems in 1 minute with 70% accuracy, and they can't do that, even if they got an A in math, well, then they didn't meet that goal and they didn't master that skill. And now we have to talk about what do we do from here. So I would say grades, to me, the grades are probably the lowest valid data point of everything we have available, just because of the nature of grading during the last year. With the caveat being, I personally support a lot of parents with kids who just totally checked out. And they were in school, and when they were in school with teachers, they did well, but when they were home virtually, they could not manage anything and they couldn't get themselves through anything, and then their grades bottomed out. I think that is a valid piece of information. So again, that goes back to everything being highly individualized.
Can I ask one more data question, and then I'll let you go on?
Yes.
Can you use the present level of assessment in the IEP?
So the question is, can you use the present levels in the IEP for data? And absolutely, that is probably one of your stronger data points, especially if you have present levels and you can look back through several IEPs and you see that the present levels are at a lower level now than they were an IEP or two ago. That is a really strong piece of data to show that someone should be getting compensatory services. So information to consider. So if you were not provided one of those parent input forms, you might want to provide that type of information directly to your child's school and email them and request in writing that the compensatory discussion get started. Schools should be looking not only for regression, but lack of progress. So my daughter, for example, stayed exactly the same in some of her reading skills. And on the one hand, it's great that she didn't go down. And on the other, well, she stayed exactly the same, guys. That means that something didn't move forward. So that was an easy way to start a comp ed conversation because the data was everything's exactly the same as March 13th, 2020. And appropriate progress is unique to the individual student. So we hear this all the time, and IEP is not a guaranteed outcome. But an IEP should be designed for a student to make adequate progress in light of their abilities. And if they don't make progress, then we should be having a compensatory conversation. And I think that we should be looking at kind of the gamut of what that includes. If they did not progress at the same pace as they did while in person, if skills remained exactly the same, and if they lost skills, all of that can fall under this compensatory education umbrella. I added this in because the MSDE guide said you should consider whether the school did everything they could to help your child when you're requesting comp ed. And I think that's lovely if a school did everything they could to support your child, but if their efforts were unsuccessful, that's okay. This is not, we're not here to assign blame. We can recognize the hard work of our educators and also recognize that for some kids, it was not successful. And even if they did everything they could, and even if they did more than that, we can still be asking for comp ed as parents, because the primary person we're considering is our kid and not how the grownups feel about our kid, or quite frankly, us as parents. So what type of services can you get through compensatory education? And I think we have to go back to the goal of comp ed is to put the child in the position they would have been in, but for the denial of FAPE. So compensatory education can be literally anything a student needs to remediate a denial of FAPE. It can include your more traditional services, straight tutoring, speech for speech, OT for OT, etc. But it could also be some kind of outside of the box solution. It can be a camp, a class, a social skills group. It can be any activity designed to remediate what was lost. I haven't had this happen as much in Montgomery County as I had I've done a lot more litigation in DC, so perhaps that's why we land sometimes at more creative solutions. But I've had kids get like horseback riding therapy as compensatory education, because what they lost out was on, core strength because they didn't have physical therapy, or art therapy as compensatory education. There's a social skills camp in Rockville that I've had funded for a few students, because what they lost out on couldn't really be made up for in a one-on-one tutoring session after school. It really needed something different. So if you are a person whose kid needs something different, you should be asking for that. So when should I hear from my child's school? We talked about this a bit earlier. They gave them a year. So most of those distance learning meetings happened September, October of last year. So you should be hearing soon about the process. Many of us have already, and some comp ed meetings have already been had, and some will be scheduled. I'm guessing once all of the beginning of year data is collected, that's when there'll be another wave of us hearing about these meetings.
Yeah, in terms of timing, somebody asked in Zoom, they were provided compensatory services on the prior end of the last school year, and they've been asking for services to start since the summer, but no teachers are interested in providing services. They've talked to the MCPS, RAC.
Raccoon? Yes.
Because that is up to the school to provide, and the school at this point still has no one. And then after asking multiple times, the school and Raccoon, they are hoping I go away. At one point, we started forcing them to start providing services or get funding to find private services. These services run out.
So I actually think that is my next slide. So the question was essentially, a comp ed meeting was had in the spring, and we agreed upon a bucket of services for my student, but MCPS never had anyone to provide it. And they already went to resolution and compliance, and resolution and compliance said, well, the school has to do it. So compensatory education services are provided outside of the school day. And I'm just going to click through because I do believe the answer comes, there we go. I'm going to talk about this slide all at once just to answer that question, but I'll put all the information up on the screen. I have seen MCPS up until now taking 3 approaches. The first is your child's school can manage the comp ed, and then it's one of the teachers at that school who can implement the services outside of the school day. There's also supposed to be a central office kind of list of teachers who have said they are available to provide compensatory education, and MCPS can pull from that pool and assign that person to your child. And then there's the third, which is MCPS paying for it. So to answer that specific question, if it has been since summer and I was promised a service and I was told that no one's available, you can ask for it to be paid for yesterday. Because there's really no reason to wait. The big catch is that if you ask for something to be paid for, Resolution and Compliance Unit, which is RACU, does an administrative review. They send you an agreement, and that agreement asks you to accept this comp ed in exchange for waiving a whole bunch of other things. And whether that is a good decision for you and your child is particularly unique to whether the comp ed that they are offering solves all of the problems that you have today. So I would say if you're in that position, proceed with caution. Ask a lot of questions of the person you're getting that document from. Consider, an outside source. Because if they're offering to pay for something, they're asking you to give something up in return, and you need to be careful about what you're giving up. Yes.
Do 504 plan students qualify for compensatory services, such as like a camp and those you mentioned?
Technically, yes. So the question is, do students with 504 plans qualify for compensatory services? And the answer is yes, if there is demonstrated harm because of whatever could not be implemented or provided through virtual instruction that was in that 504.
Would that go through a counselor at school?
And the question is that from the school counselor? And the answer is yes, because the counselor is the case manager. For my oldest kiddo who has a 504 plan, I got that same exact form letter that I did for the IEPs, but it said 504 in it instead of IEP. So I would say for a student with a 504, your ability to prove that the lack of accommodations caused harm, it might be a little bit harder. So I would be really honing in on what information you have to show the school to why there was a harm, if that makes sense. Yes.
Compensatory hours. What is the determinant those compensatory hours are data they will give you at the end to say, see, is reached this level. How do you determine that those are adequate compensatory hours? Why sometimes offer a certain amount of hours? And after that, not only did you reach the level, you actually regressed. Went even further, because when you went back to school, it was a different format with many more kids in school, very attention seeking. Behavior is changing. So, what determines whether those compensatory services are offered adequate, or can we go back to them and say, it didn't work, could we get more of this compensatory?
So the question is, how do I know if the compensatory education that was provided was adequate? And if it was not adequate, can we go back and ask for more? And this particular example was the student went back to school in August and was even further behind than they were before after having received compensatory education. So I would say there's a few things going on there. Assuming you did not sign off on one of those weird waiver clauses, you can always ask for more compensatory education. And then the other piece of it is, but what does he need in his IEP? Because he's now a different child than he was on March 12th, 2020. So it could very well be that more compensatory education or different compensatory education is needed. But it could also be that the services in the IEP as they are today are not reflective of what your student needs. And you need to look at the IEP, the services, the placement, et cetera. And they are two separate but related analyses.
So how do you activate the combat services? Somebody wants to utilize a private provider. How should they communicate that to the school?
So the question is from a parent who wants to use a private provider, how do they activate that and how do they notify the school system? With MCPS, they have been funding them up. They have been agreeing to fund them. So it's usually an agreement that says we agree that we will pay 65, I think it's $60 an hour is what they said for tutors for 50 hours. I'm picking numbers out of thin air. And if you do that and you have one of those agreements, then you have to go through resolution and compliance to essentially get repaid for what you paid out. But if you have not reached that agreement with MCPS, you need to ask them up front to say, my kid needs comp ed, I've asked for it, I've waited patiently for you to assign someone, there's no one available, I am now asking that it be funded so I can get a provider in the community. And I would go through resolution and compliance for that, including your school level case manager or RITC.
And what, if you're given the paper that the needs may, what sort of things would they have?
Generally speaking, the question is, if you're being asked to sign an agreement where you waive things, what are you asking to waive? From what I have seen in these agreements, it is you're waiving potential denials of FAPE from prior to today to prior to the day you sign it. So what's today, September 18th? If I get an agreement on September 18th that says MCPS agrees to pay for 50 hours of tutoring for a Glassman child, in that agreement, it says, I agree that this is resolving all potential of denials of FAPE through today. And there are times where, okay, they're giving you something and it's worth saying, this is a clean slate and we can move forward tomorrow, and anything that happens tomorrow is a new legal issue. And there are times where the compensatory education is one piece of a puzzle of what needs to happen for your child. And you might want to look back at the IEP, and there might be other things that were wrong that you want to be addressed. And a broad waiver clause is giving up some of those rights. I have seen two versions of the waiver clause, which makes me think it depends on who's writing it. I have seen one that is limited to compensatory education and doesn't really address other potential denials of FAPE. And I've seen one that is a really big umbrella that says, you're agreeing that this bucket of tutoring hours resolves everything that might have happened before today. And that's the one that I would be weary of as a parent before signing.
How do you get the school to change that? Say, I'm not signing this unless you get rid of that clause.
So the question is, how do you get the school to change that? And that is something that goes through the resolution and compliance unit and whoever it is that is authorizing it. If resolution and compliance is communicating to the school, who's then communicating to you, I would jump over the school and go to resolution and compliance directly. There's been some staffing changes over there. There's someone new to Montgomery County who's come from Prince George's County. So we'll see how that goes as she adjusts to an MCPS land, I guess. So what if I disagree with the decision? And any disagreement with a comp ed decision should be documented in a prior written notice. That's the document you get after IEP meetings that should explain what happened, but should also specifically document if you disagree. I have seen, not necessarily related to COVID, but in general, school system agrees that student is entitled to 25 hours of comp ed and the parent disagrees. But we do agree that because we have, the parent wants more, but we agree to start implementing what we agree on. And then a parent can seek further redress by exercising their due process rights. So a parent who disagrees with the comp ed decision can request mediation, file a state complaint, or file a due process complaint. And just wanted to highlight this because I have seen some MSDE findings that the distance learning plan is our guidepost, and that is that's what schools were required to implement. And if the reason you're disagreeing is because the distance learning plan slashed stuff off your child's IEP, then when you're filing that complaint, you need to address both. Because if you're just saying, well, the comp ed was wrong because my kid, should have gotten makeup services for what was in the IEP, you also have to challenge the reduction or changes from the IEP to the distance learning plan, or the state will kick you out, essentially. I see Jennifer agreeing with me. So other tips and IEP services versus compensatory education, and I think this goes to the question you were asking a little while ago. An IEP has to address all of the students' current needs, including anything that is new or different now as a result of the pandemic. This is different from whether they need compensatory education to redress a denial of FAPE. So this really goes to we know that our child was harmed and we want comp ed. And also, in addition to that, we think our kid has more needs now than they did 18 months ago, and we need to talk about that too in the IEP. Oh, whoopsies, I hit something. Another piece of that is that some students might respond better to increasing or modifying services within their school day versus adding an additional service on top of their school day. So comp ed services are provided after school hours on the weekends and on breaks. If at 3:15 or 3:25 p.m. your kid is toast and cannot benefit from having another person in their lives, well then let's talk about how we modify the IEP to push this into the school day. And some students might require both changes to the IEP and compensatory services. And I would say that a student who is not eligible for compensatory education, or the school system says they're not eligible for compensatory education, whether you agree with that or not, you can still look at what their needs are in the IEP and how that might be different as a result of being virtual for 18 months. Yes.
We need to know your child a little bit more. This to me has become some kind of a problem. We need to know your child a bit more. We need a bit more time. We need to collect a bit more. Is there a time frame to be for this? Or do you take their word, or do you have to push ahead and say, no, I have enough data, I'm seeing it at home, and this is what it is? How do we?
So the question is, what happens if you're bringing this to the attention of your child's school and their response is, well, we need more data and we need more time to collect data. We need to know your child more before we make those decisions. And I think this is where there is a fine line as a parent between being patient and being persistent that we have to walk. Schools just started August 30th. It has been a rough few weeks, right? So I think we can give a little bit more grace and leeway than we might want to, but not too much that things are like ridiculous. So what I'm really looking at is that interim marking period, so mid-October, as one kind of guidepost to say, okay, you have data. And then the second being mid-November, the end of the first quarter. And if between those 2 points, they're still saying we need more data, I think that's kind of your Hamlet situation. But by the interim marking period, they have grades, they have MAP scores, they have reading levels, they have math levels. There's enough information that we can say, all right, we have a different kiddo than left us 18 months ago, and we need to really make some tough choices here. And I think everyone who has a student with an IEP probably knows this, but IEP changes, by that I mean the gamut of anything: increasing specialized instruction, modifying your pull-out versus push-in, increasing related services, changes to least restrictive environment and placement. I think we're going to have kind of, trying to reword this in my brain. I wouldn't jump too quickly to say, okay, you know, this was so bad for my kid right now, we need to look at placement. I would give that grace period to see if they adjust and start moving forward. But at the same time, some kids really fell behind and are not going to make it up just by going back to school. And if that's the case, we really need to be able to say, well, after being out of school for 18 months, and I appreciate that we turned on the Zoom every day, but it didn't work. And now we really need to look at, where is my child compared to their age level peers? What services do they need to make progress today? And if that means changing placement, that means changing placement. Yes.
Like you mentioned the concepts services including like therapies. What kind of therapies? Like, if you just look when they go to the school that can be used that service, or what's the process?
So the question is, what is the process to identify a compensatory education provider? And that really depends on your setup with your school system, with your child's school. If MCPS is the entity that is providing the compensatory education, then they would identify one of their speech pathologists or occupational therapists or physical therapists from their staff who has agreed to provide comp ed after school.
But how to start that? Like they just let the why I let the counselors that I'm thinking to apply for compensatory services. How do I start? Do I start in that?
So the question is, if I haven't even engaged in this discussion at all, how do I start? Do I write my counselor? And yes. So if you have not heard from your child's school, I would say by that first interim, mid-October, I would reach out to the case manager, to the counselor, whoever is responsible for case management for the 504 or the IEP, and say, hey, we haven't talked about comp ed yet, and I really think we need to, and here's why. And they should schedule that meeting.
Next question. How the 504 plan and IEP have impact on the children when they apply for college?
So the question is, how does having an IEP or a 504 impact a child when they apply for college? It shouldn't. Once you're an adult and you're in college, if you wish to have disability services, you have to affirmatively seek them yourself. So I don't think it should impact the college application process. And then when your now 17-year-old becomes an 18-year-old college student, they have to go to the college, to the disability coordinator, and say, this is what I had in high school. I would like to get services from you now.
But you apply process, you don't show that at all, right? Do you, like when you apply, do you have to disclose that I have this?
So
the application.
The question is, do you have to disclose an IEP or 504 status? I don't know, but I don't think so. Yes.
One thing about school district that blames you for not putting you back in school when it's hybrid or in school learning. Is if you had the option, you could have come back in.
So the question is, what happens if the school is blaming the parent for not putting their child back in person at an earlier date? And I think school districts like to blame parents for stuff, right? So that is a common theme that we sometimes see, but I don't think, I would elevate that above the school and to the compliance office and kind of down that road, because one, it was a parent choice whether or not we wanted our children to return in person back in the spring. And if your reason for not returning in person, quite frankly, it shouldn't matter, but I'm sure there was a reason, and the reason is justifiable and you could explain that. So I don't think that's a valid reason not to provide compensatory education, but it might be something that needs to be elevated above the school level in order to make some headway.
And one more question. Even now, with mask on for kids who don't process language very well, it's still a problem. So how do you deal with the fact that you might need compensatory education just because of the current situation?
So the question is, for children who have language processing delays or other, where masking makes it difficult for them to understand, what do you do? What do you do about that now? So compensatory education is not limited to virtual school. So I would say you can continue to request it for future, like in the future, for current denials of faith. So it's not something that is limited. Somebody asked earlier, and I don't think I answered, how long do I have? My answer is a very legal one. There is a 2-year statute of limitations to file a complaint. So that is how long you have to challenge these things. Same thing for compensatory education. If I'm just getting around to now asking for something from 2 school years ago, technically I can, because it's in the statute of limitations period.
Or at least those 2 exceptions to the statute?
Yes. And the comment was, if it meets the 2 exceptions to the statute of limitations, which are more or less fraud, if information was withheld from you as a parent, or the parent did not have reason to know of the potential denial of FAPE, it's a new or should have known standard, then you can go beyond the statute of limitations.
Or if they present something to you as solved.
Yes, or if they presented something to you as solved that wasn't solved. That's, in my mind, that fraud one. And I've had cases which went beyond the statute of limitations, primarily in like a child find situation where the school system should have affirmatively evaluated and never brought to a parent's attention, hey, I think your kid needs an evaluation. That I've seen go 5-7 years back. You had a question.
How about for the non-pure academic aspect? stipulated on data collection there?
So the question is for the non-academic goals, for things like social, emotional, or executive functioning, how do I collect the data? A formal way to collect the data or to ask the school to collect the data is to ask for a functional behavior assessment where they actually look at those specific behavior-based skills. For things like executive functioning, I think that's a little trickier of a data collection tool, but there's a goal that is associated with that present level, and ask for data collection on that goal, because then you can go back to the present level and see if the present level has changed. Theoretically, there should be data collection because we get progress reports, but it's not always as detailed as we would like. But if there are particular skills that you really feel like need to be the focus of attention, I would ask for specific data collection from the current classroom teacher on that skill. Let's see. I think something got lost in my animation when I switched from Google Slides to a PowerPoint. So IEP versus compensatory education continued. I think I probably talked about all of this, but compensatory education is designed to address a specific deficit caused by a denial of faith. It is intended to be for a specific period of time that concludes after a specific period of time unless another agreement is reached. Where an IEP has to be reasonably calculated to ensure that the student makes progress in light of their potential. So I think those are the two things that are sometimes clashing when we have these conversations. And if the comp ed's over and the problem's not solved, well, then we need to look back to this IEP and see if we need to make further changes.
You're saying that they have slipped or they have like become stagnant with their peers, and you would sometimes you can actually like hammer out certain numerical goals on that, right? In order to say if as long as they can get this many words per minute reading, then the comp ed has been its goal.
Yes. So the question and comment was, can't your comp ed have goals that are measurable just like the IEP? And then if you meet them, you can say that they've been met. And your example is the one I was going to use because it's an easier one. But my daughter has comp ed now from MCPS, and she's getting it with one of her teachers from her school who she had an existing relationship with, which is wonderful. And it's a fluency goal because she was not able to use Read Naturally during Zoom school for reasons I won't rehash kind of thing. But we were able to very easily see her reading fluency used to be X, now it is Y, and to get it back to X, we've put comp ed in place. And at the end of this period, which we agreed would be the summer plus the first semester, if she's not back to where she started, I think that's when I can say, okay, we need to continue this after school effort. You know, she's recouped some of the skill, but she still has ways to go. Or if she's recouped all of the skill, then we've accomplished our goal and we could all, you know, congratulate ourselves on a job well done. So I think for some of the pure academic skills, you can certainly do that. So compensatory services must do more than the IEP. They must compensate for lost skill or lost time or et cetera. So there are times where compensatory education awards look bigger than what caused that harm in the first place. And the comp ed might be time limited. So I've seen a lot of them from MCPS be designed for summer plus first semester, not only my own, I've seen that for some other families as well, where the IEP continues for the full IEP year, just as any IEP would. So I think that brings me to the end of the slideshow and more time than I was probably allotted, but if there's any other questions, I'm happy to answer them.
I have several if you want. I'll make Zoom.
Oh, sure. I think Melissa has something in the back.
My question is, can you please describe inability to focus during an afternoon or class or virtual instruction? Or the need to move around? Is a valid reason to ask for compensatory educational services in those courses?
So the question is, if your child was unable to focus during virtual instruction, I assume in the afternoon session of a core academic class, is that a reason to ask for comp ed now? And I think that the answer is yes, because if they were unable to focus, then they did not progress in the way that they should have. And now there are some skill gaps. Even though they've moved along to the next grade, they might need to fill in some of those skills from the prior grade in order to move on successfully. Some of that, I believe, is, I say this with a degree of caution. MCPS has said they know that that happened, they're prepared for it, and they're going to go back and fill in those holes. But I think it depends on how big those gaps are and what skills need to be worked on and whether that's successful for your kid. But it is definitely a valid reason to ask for compensatory services.
Just to follow on that, that's so much better. That's the kind of question I have that happened. But for example, my son, I know, paid no attention to science, but he was, because he had special ed teachers teaching him something at math. Gen Ed for science and social studies, and pretty much all of the work grade is a wash. Whatever they taught him, nothing, right? For that kind of stuff. Like, does that count? Can I have them provide compensatory services for science and social studies, or they're not considered for subject?
So the question is, for an elementary school student who got essentially nothing from science and social studies during virtual school, is that something that can serve for comp ed? I think that one's a little bit trickier. I have a 5th grader now, so my 4th grader is in that same boat. I didn't even make him try to pay attention to science and social studies because it just, like, we were done. And the question is, what is the educational harm to them going forward? And if the answer is, well, they're just going to do 5th grade science and social studies now, and they will eventually learn whatever they were taught in 4th grade when it comes up in middle school and high school, I don't know if that is something that I would push as hard on as reading. But if there's a connection back to reading, which I think with science and social studies there often is, it's certainly worthy of conversation. I had a lot of pick my battles situations through virtual instruction, and science and social studies was not one I chose to pick. So whatever he did, and what he didn't do is all right. So for me, I guess it would really depend on how much was missed and what was missed and what the impact of that missed instruction was for the future.
And it's hard to measure the impact of missed instruction. You know, it really comes down to knowledge and skills. So which one is more critical to the child? The knowledge we can back up, the skills are a lot harder, right? So.
Yes. So the comment is, it's really a matter of knowledge versus skills, and if it's knowledge can be learned later, but it's skills that need to be made up for, and I think that is a fair analysis. If what you lost out on from not getting to participate effectively in social studies is a reading comprehension skill, then that is more ripe for compensatory education. Then eventually you will get to those topics in US history. I don't even know what they taught in 4th grade social studies. That's how aware I was. But it'll come up in middle school at some point, right? And if they get that piece of information in middle school, do they have the skill set to do what they need to do? Yes.
So if a child is allowed to own one and say the parent has to pay for it, their child will be engaged in the virtual their behavior that they were seeing. Is there an opportunity to get reimbursed for
So the question is, if a child had a one-on-one aide in their IEP and the parent essentially hired someone to serve that function at home, can they get reimbursed for it? And I would say the answer is yes, but you probably need to pursue that through either due process or mediation or going through resolution and compliance. It is not something that will be volunteered. Yes. So the question is, what situations require what degree of professional help and an advocate versus an attorney? So that is, I think, a hard question to answer just from which professional do you need, because I can file a due process complaint and my educational advocate components cannot. They have a knowledge of special education that I have picked up over the years, but I am not a trained special educator. So that is where there's kind of overlap and distinction. Because compensatory education is a legal remedy, if you are having an argument over that and you need to elevate it to due process or what have you, you might actually want both. You might want the advocate to be able to say, in my expert opinion, as a special educator, the student needs X, and the lawyer to be the one who pushes that forward legally. When do you need one as a parent? I've brought advocates to my own child's IEP meeting. Jennifer came with me probably like 6 years ago because I was just tired, right? So sometimes it's really, I really don't wish to be the one steering this ship, and I would like to alleviate that pressure from me as a parent and have somebody else do it. And sometimes it is, I have been pushing and fighting and I'm banging my head against the wall and I need help. And I even have parents who I have represented for 12, 13, 14 years where everything's fine right now, but they just like it that I sit next to them because it gives them the confidence that once a year at the IEP meeting, it's a few $100 and they know that their lawyer who's been with them since pre-K is still there. So I've seen the whole range.
I don't know any counselor is equipped to deal with, kids with special education. My question is that how, because even my daughter, she feels that the counselor doesn't like her. But how can I get a fair, this as counselor right recommendation letter for the students? How can I make sure that she would do the fair thing for her? Because I personally also feel that way.
So the question is, since the counselor is a person who writes a letter of recommendation, how do I get a fair shake if I feel like the counselor doesn't like my student? And I would say that is probably something I would bring to the school administration, to the principal, to ask for a change of counselor, if that's really the case. And sometimes it is, like sometimes personalities don't align, and the best thing you could do is ask for something different. So I think you had some chat questions.
Somebody has a 12th grader, and the question was how to
So the question is about a 12th grader and how do they slow their child down, essentially?
maybe for testing, because there's not testing, there's celebrating the process.
So I would say if you are in the 12th grade and you have accumulated credits towards graduating from high school, it is hard to slow that down because there is not really a mechanism for part-time attendance. And I've had this come up a few times over the summer where parents really just felt like what their kid needed was more time in school, but they were about to meet those diploma requirements, and that was something that clashed. So once you meet diploma requirements, it is hard to say your student should be in school longer. However, compensatory education is not time limited. It can extend past graduation. So if you're asking for compensatory education services, you can get that beyond your high school diploma if that is what you need to remedy a harm.
What about other fields of law that aren't, for example, are not legal?
So the question is if a student's behaviors essentially and their inability to engage in virtual instruction led to an academic decline, but they don't necessarily have goals in those areas, can you ask for comp ed? And my answer to that is yes, because the harm is inability to engage in instruction, and the remedy is giving access to the instruction that was lost. So if behaviorally you did not participate in instruction or you lost academic skills, I think we're going to see a lot of little guys with writing deficits that did not pick up a pen for an entire year. And I think that can be addressed through compensatory education. Yes. Oh, sure. Is there anything I need to repeat from the last answer or two, or are we good?
In our, they have, new where they're doing social, emotional, benefits. So it's, you know, from the social aspect. The thing about it is that, I hear that they're going to look at anyone's compliance over the COVID period as social and emotionally driven, as opposed to not having access to instruction or being. How do you assess those two out? If they should put it all into the social emotional bucket as opposed to not being.
So the question is, if my school system is doing a social emotional assessment and is using social emotional to say the impact of COVID was social and emotional and it was not academic or not from lack of access to instruction, how do I separate that out for compensatory purposes? And I think it's the same kind of similar answer to what I answered before. I don't think it matters. What caused or what drove the harm is not the basis of how we solve the harm.
Right. I think the tendency is that they put more of it on the parent. It's the sorrow and get it social emotional. And what drove the harm is a real key statement. You know what they needed that they didn't get or how that type of instruction affected them.
Yes, so the comment is if there's fear that school systems will look at that social emotional piece to put blame on the parent or the student rather than say, we need to address this through the IEP or comp ed. And I think that is a definite thing that we see in educational advocacy world. And it's on us as parents and advocates to say, to push back on that. Because when my own kid was melting during virtual instruction and he needed not to sit in front of Zoom, the fact that I didn't make him sit in front of Zoom is not like my fault or his fault, nor was it his teacher's fault. It was just the unfortunate reality that we were faced with. I've seen a lot of times when MCPS presented on comp ed, they said, you know, through no fault of our own, some children didn't learn. And I don't know why they necessarily feel the need to emphasize that. Like, we could all accept that this is not a blame issue. Nobody wanted to be in this position. But we are, and now we have kids that we have to deal with as a result of it. And that is really what matters, is how do we make these little people whole? And that's really should be the focus of our conversation. I think sometimes as parents, like, I want my kids' schools to like me and to want to work with me, and I don't want to hurt their feelings. And I have to sometimes like make myself put that aside to say, nobody's feelings are hurt. They understand why I'm asking these questions. And they know that at the end of the day, it's about my kid and what they need. So I think that's the balance that needs to be kind of struck there. Yeah, so the question is, for a student who missed school for health reasons prior to COVID, is there a period of time you can look back for compensatory services? And the answer is that 2-year statute of limitations period. I think it becomes very tricky when you have missed school, and if it's a health reason, there are only, there's fairly limited opportunities for home instruction when you have a child who's missing school for health reasons. And putting that back together sometimes means comp ed, sometimes means looking at the IEP, and sometimes means both. So the question is there a difference between compensatory education and the term MCPS is using of compensatory recovery services? I don't think so. I think compensatory recovery services makes people feel better that it's not their fault, but at the end of the day, it's the same thing. Okay, so I'm hearing that we got everybody in the chat, so I think that might have been all the questions.
If we know that the child's IEP is not working, is there a time period in which we can actually finish the check? Is there a time frame that we need to give it to work? 3 months, 4 months, and then it's not working, and we go back to it and say that the IEP is not working. Stuff like that. Is there a time frame that we can give on an IEP?
So the question is, if we as parents know the IEP is not working, is there a time frame that we have to give before we go back to the table? So legally and practically, you can ask for an IEP meeting at any time. So there's not a specific period of time you have to wait, but practically you have to wait long enough that hopefully they say they have the same opinion you do when you get back to the table. And that is that balance that I think we talked about earlier, and perhaps waiting for the end of the first quarter, because then you have some real information to work with. I don't like waiting longer than that personally, because then you have, if you're looking at changing placement, there are several steps involved. You have to have an IEP meeting, you have to go up the chain of command, you have to potentially get a new placement, and that takes time. So you want to have enough time where the people at the table have the information they need to make the right decision, and not so much time that you have lost a whole school year. And that is the balance that I think we have to walk when we're making those arguments.
I'm still getting used to it. They kind of talk in straight line. They kind of talk. I usually have to tell them, can you just give me that what exactly? Because they keep going around using very diplomatic language sometimes. I can't understand what they actually trying to say. So like my eldest son, I have 2 of this. So my eldest son, they have sent me that form which is show compensatory services. So I signed that. But every time I go back to them and say, okay, when is the receiving? We are seeing what is the appropriate service that you need. You come back to school, already 18, and I heard nothing from school. I signed the thing, they'll be wonderful, everything is fine. So where are the compensations that I signed? Oh, we're looking into where of the period, we're gathering the we are, listen, we'll get back to you. So that's why is there a time frame? Just if I tell you, thank you for your answer. Quarter, then I can go back to that. But I feel because every now and then they have also there's a winter break, and then this holiday, and then teachers' education, and then oh, we will be having school this time. So and all of these gaps, what happens is
Yeah, so the comment and the question is, basically when the school talks at you in circles, what do you do about it? And how do you deal with that? And I think what you said is I've had a lot of parents say that, to say, listen, I'm not an educator and I'm not a lawyer. I'm gonna need you to break that down for me a lot simpler, and you need to talk to me like I know nothing. And there's also a point where you have to say, I have been very patient waiting out this process, and I am familiar with my due process rights, and I don't wish to exercise them, so I need you to move this process forward. I have reached my limits, and either you do it or I'm going to elevate it to the next level. A lot of times that does get things moving.
No more questions? Okay, well, thank you so much, Kim. I think it's incredibly informative, so helpful. And I just want everybody to know we have been recording this, and then so if you want to review it, it will be on our website very soon, both in Spanish and in English. And I'm going to send an email to everybody who registered with a link to the recordings. So you'll be getting that next day or two. And thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you.